I want you to imagine that you have 10,000 rupees and that you're eyeing a new pair of sneakers. You want to buy it, but your friend then comes to you and says, "Hey bro, wait. I think there's deflation in the country, prices are falling for everything, and I think you'll get the sneaker for 9,000 rupees soon." What will you do? Will you wait or will you buy it immediately? That is the dilemma when it comes to deflation. And economists in India are actually talking about the D word now.
Vegetable deflation is still pending.
Rural inflation has actually turned negative. The deflation trap.
Food price inflation in negative territory.
But what really is deflation? Why do economists worry about it? And is deflation and disinflation the same thing? That is what you'll understand in this video. Okay, let's start with what you are probably familiar with, inflation. Now, this is when we have to pay higher prices for our vegetables, our biscuits, our fuel, and hotel rooms when we travel, compared to what we paid for all of this a year ago. But deflation, it's just the opposite. It's when the prices for these goods and services actually fall. So if you paid 100 rupees for 1 liter of petrol in October of 2024, and today you pay just 90 rupees, that is deflation. Now, I do have to point out that people might be using the word deflation a little too loosely in India at the moment, because the latest consumer price index, or the CPI number for October, says that the prices rose by 0.25%. Sure, in some pockets, prices have dropped, such as for vegetables and other food stuff. But for the most part, prices are still rising. Clothing, housing, fuel, these are all more expensive today. And it's just that the overall rise in prices is not as fast as before. And remember, all of this is when we compare it to what the prices were for these things at the same time last year. So technically, you could say that we are only looking at disinflation. This means the prices are rising, but at a slower rate. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about why inflation in India seems to have cooled off for now. But before that, I'm going to tell you why economists, they live in fear of negative inflation or deflation. Because on the face of it, it seems like a very silly fear to have. Intuitively, lower prices for goods and services is a great idea. You can buy more things for the same amount of money. Your purchasing power is increasing. You actually feel like you have more money in your pocket. But to understand why economists hate it, let's rewind back a little to your sneaker buying dilemma. Think about it again. Would you buy the sneaker if you knew for sure that prices for everything around you are falling? I know I would wait before I decide to buy. And if everyone around me thinks the same way as me, everyone will spend less money today thinking they can buy things for cheaper tomorrow. Now, think about how bad this will be for a business. Because if the demand falls and the supply stays the same, the prices will eventually have to fall. And when that happens, businesses will start to see less profit. And no one likes to see their profits shrink. So the business will try to do something about it. The owner of the shop is now getting 1,000 rupees less for each pair. And he or she may try to cut costs to make up for this loss. And since salaries are usually the biggest expense item for a business, the easiest way to cut costs is by reducing the number of workers on the payroll or by even cutting their pay. Put simply, people could lose their jobs and get paid less money if deflation takes hold in the economy. This could even turn into a vicious cycle because people will be worried about what their future looks like. They may decide not to buy things after all. They might want to save money for the worst times that might come ahead. And that sneaker has no buyer. It'll sit on the shelf for a longer time and it'll put pressure on the business owner. The store owner could then be forced to cut the sneaker's price even more just to sell something and make money. They might cut it to 8,500 rupees. And when they do that, what do you think will happen? They'll need to cut the staff's salaries or let go of people again. Unemployment will rise, the spending drops, economic growth is hurt, and eventually this could turn into a full-blown recession. That is why economists are so afraid of deflation. So, what can policymakers do to fight deflation? Their usual tool is to cut interest rates. They'll try to make loans cheaper. They hope that this will nudge people into borrowing more money and actually spending it in the economy. But even that is hard in a deflationary world. And just hear me out, right? For instance, you have a 0% interest rate situation. If you borrow 10,000 rupees to buy that sneaker, you still have to pay 10,000 rupees back in say 6 months. But the price of the sneaker might fall in that time. So you are effectively spending more for the sneaker than it will be worth in a few months. And people might not be inclined to even borrow money and spend it once they realize this. And the one tool that policymakers have in their arsenal to push spending and growth could turn into a huge dud. That is the problem. Do you remember Japan's lost decade? Well, actually, not just one decade, but maybe 3 lost decades. After World War II, Japan had a great economic bull run. Land prices, wages, stocks, economic growth, everything was soaring. Till it all burst in the early 90s and the country entered a period of chronic deflation. Prices kept dropping, wages were stagnant or even negative. Economic growth, that was next to nothing. Now we won't get into the why of Japan's struggles today, but just know that policymakers struggled to pull the economy out of this rut. I did say 3 decades. So whenever deflationary trends pop up, policymakers think about Japan and it sends a shiver down their spines. But should you be worried whenever you see reduced prices for something? Not always, because there's good deflation and bad deflation. So the simplest way to think about good deflation is when prices fall thanks to technological progress. Imagine there's a new invention that makes it 10 times cheaper to produce cars. The price of the car will drop, but the car company is still profitable, right? And if they're profitable, everyone keeps their job and everyone can now afford a new, cheaper car. Or in an economic sense, the demand remains constant or it even grows. That is good deflation. Bad deflation is when the demand collapses and businesses are forced to cut prices to move inventory and keep their lights on. Like the sneaker example. That is the kind of deflation that economists worry about. Bad deflation can also be a result of structural overcapacity, which is when a country builds too much factories and stuff to produce goods and services. And they're forced to keep it churning just because they already have all that capacity. Now they'll have to dump the excess, and weak demand means prices will keep falling. China is actually facing this situation right now. But let's not get into China and let's turn back to India and the big question we asked. Will we have deflation in India? Probably not. All the economists who you heard at the start do believe that in a couple of months, India's inflation will be back higher at 3 to 4%. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Reason number 1 is the base effect. See, the 0.25% inflation that you see and hear about is calculated based on the price levels at the same point last year. So if prices were high last year, you get a high base, which makes today's inflation actually look lower. For example, let's take 3 years to understand how this works better. Say in October 2023, the price of milk was 100 rupees. A year later, in October 2024, it shoots up and is now at 110 rupees. It's an anomaly because milk prices don't typically jump by 10% in a year. But it happened. But the next year, it's more typical. Milk prices, which were already high, has now risen only to 112 rupees. The high base of the previous year means that the milk inflation number comes in at just 1.8% now. That is a base effect. And in India, the retail inflation was 6.2% in October 2024, and food inflation was in double digits at 10.9%. So the base was already high. And this makes the latest CPI numbers look quite low because it's calculated on that base. Over the next couple of months, this base effect will slowly start to wear off and inflation will revert to something that's more normal. Another factor seems to be the GST rate cuts. Do you see all those websites screaming lower MRPs with GST benefits? Well, that's because in September of this year, the government cut the GST on a whole range of things. And most businesses passed along these reduced prices to customers like you and me. So you get lower prices without doing really anything. And none of these, what we just spoke about, none of them points to a structurally deflationary environment in India. Everyone believes that what we are experiencing right now is just a temporary phenomenon, and soon we'll be back to the higher levels of inflation that we are all used to seeing. That's what economists are expecting. So yeah, there you have it. Now you know why economists spend all their time worrying about falling prices. And if you have any thoughts about deflation after watching this video, we'd love to know what you think. Drop in your thoughts in the comments and we'll be happy to answer them.